Fortunately, today we do have Brian Schwalb, DC's Attorney General, not Charles Schwab, that Lisa inadvertently mentioned last week. I'd much prefer to hear from Brian. He's the second independently elected Attorney General of the District of Columbia and has served the public for decades, well before this very difficult job. A third generation Washingtonian. You've all read his bio, so I won't bother. But Brian ran a fair election campaign, and he is not a politician, thank God. And that limited donors to $200 maximum donation. And one of his opponents, I believe, spent 600 or 800,000, and the public spoke, which is wonderful. Last April of last year, Brian attended the Mount Zion Cemetery Emancipation Day service, and I was really impressed that I didn't see any photo ops. He was there 2 to 2.5 hours, and all he wanted to do was speak to every person at that site, at that ceremony. Pretty impressive. He's doing a great job. It's a real privilege to have him. Please welcome Brian Schwalb.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Sheldon, thank you very, very much for the invitation, the gracious introduction. President Cohen, it's always nice to be with you. You're one of my sheroes. So thank you all for listening to me. I want to leave some time for us to have a conversation, talk a little bit about what's going on in the Office of Attorney General, and particularly focus on young people, because young people and making sure we're really protecting and raising up healthy, hopeful young people runs through a lot of what the Office of Attorney General is focused on. As Sheldon mentioned, I've been the Attorney General for the District of Columbia now for about 11 months. Oftentimes people refer to me as the new Attorney General. And I say, as long as that's the adjective you want to use, I'll take it, because Lord knows that adjectives after that could be less generous than new. But the reality is we've been at the work now for 11 months. I have an extraordinarily talented team. Leadership at the top is a little shaky, but the rest of the team is great. And if you really want to know the brains and the heart and the soul of our office, it's Lauren Haggerty, who's here. She's my Chief of Staff and Senior Counsel. I'd encourage you to get to know Lauren. Lauren is in a lot of ways exactly what so many story about Washington is. She's an extraordinarily exceptional trial lawyer. She started as a prosecutor in Texas, but like so many people who want to play on the big stage when it comes to justice, policy, using the law to make people's lives better, Washington, D.C. attracted great talent in Lauren Haggerty to come to Washington to be a prosecutor. She's worked her way through the ranks and is now really my closest confidant and a great, great servant. So I'm very, very grateful that Lauren is part of our team, and I hope you get a chance to know her. I'm really inspired by Lisa Cohen in a lot of ways, but I love the fact that what she's doing with her presidency this year of the Rotary Club is to focus on kids who are in our abuse and neglect system, foster care and otherwise, because we got a lot of kids in our city who are struggling. And as the chief prosecutor for juvenile justice, the Attorney General's office, I think, has a unique standing to speak to what kind of issues are going on with young people. I told people when I was running, and I've said it over and over again, I do not intend to be the chief prosecutor for kids where the first interaction I have with young people is when the police charge them with a crime and bring them to our office. I believe we need to be much more proactively involved in young people's lives. And we've got young people who are under a tremendous amount of pressure right now. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all the things we're doing in the office around young people. But our office, in addition to doing juvenile prosecution work, the U.S. Attorney's Office, appointed by the president, does adult criminal justice in our city. And so we could have a whole conversation about statehood and about how we are compromised as a city in terms of coming up with comprehensive criminal justice reform by virtue of this bifurcated process we have in our city. Our U.S. attorney right now, Matt Graves, his office is in the same building as ours. We work very, very closely with Matt and his team, shoulder to shoulder on addressing what is the most important issue to Washingtonians right now, which is public safety. And there's not a meeting I go to where people don't want to talk about crime, public safety, And it's incumbent upon everybody who's elected, I think, to be recognizing that as our number one priority. It's certainly the number one priority in the Office of Attorney General. But the way the rules work in the District of Columbia is adult criminal justice is entrusted to the federal prosecutor appointed by the President of the United States. Under certain presidencies, you get a U.S. attorney like Matt Graves, who lives in the district, raises his kids in the district, cares about the district, and is much more willing to engage with the elected officials in the district about the way adult criminal justice is going to work. Different presidents, different administrations, different U.S. attorneys, you can have a very different dynamic. The bottom line is our chief federal prosecutor does not answer to the residents of the District of Columbia. And I think when you're talking about criminal justice, there's no more critical role in terms of the health of a community than how we apply our laws and how we ensure public safety and what we do when people violate the law and how do we prevent people from violating the law. And that's why having an elected attorney general was such an important role for the District of Columbia in terms of moving forward with our meaningful participation. For many, many years, the attorney general was appointed by the mayor. And before it was called the attorney general, it was called the Corporation Counsel. And we have a long history of great lawyers who served in that role as an appointed corporation counsel and attorney general. But the fact of the matter is that being elected to this role brings a perspective and an accountability that is different than what it existed. And we feel that very much every day in the Office of Attorney General in terms of some of the way we're going about our work. So let me just frame the conversation about kids. We can't turn on the news at night without seeing another news story about young people committing crimes, carjackings, homicides, assaults with intent to kill, too many guns. And there is no question that we have seen a rise in the number of juvenile arrests in our city, and we're seeing younger and younger kids show up in the criminal justice system with more and more serious crimes as their first crime. And that's worrisome. And we have to all be aware of that. And we have to ask ourselves why that's happening. But here's the important thing to remember. We have about 50,000 young people in our city between ages 10 and 17. We have less than 500 kids right now that are in the criminal justice system. So less than 1% of the young people in our city are caught up in the criminal justice system. That means 99% of the young people in our city are doing great. And we have to remember that when we see the news and the narrative about kids being out of control, kids off the chain, because when people talk like that, when our media spreads that, it affects everything in our ecosystem. It affects the way we look at each other. It affects the way everybody reacts to situations. And sometimes it gets very tragic very quickly. And so one of the things the Office of Attorney General is committed to doing is thinking about how are we changing the narrative about young people. Same thing with respect to kids who need the protection of our Child and Family Services Administration and are brought into the abuse and neglect system. There are kids that need protection, and the city has an obligation to do that, and the lawyers in the Office of Attorney General are counsel to that agency. But there are a lot of kids who don't need to become system involved. They need help. Their families need help. Their communities need help. And we need to try to think about proactively, how do we avoid bringing people into our system, whether it's through the abuse and neglect system or through our juvenile justice system. The government's going to do its job once we cross that Rubicon, and we will. But let's also think about how we think a little more proactively. That's not a pleasant conversation to have, unfortunately, in the way crime and justice have been politicized. It's a very hard conversation to have in the very short sound bites you get on TV. But it's a hugely important conversation to have. And I'm so grateful that you all, as leaders, as people committed to our community, would make some time in your lunch to listen to me talk a little bit about that, because I'm counting on you. Hopefully, if you think anything I say makes sense today, that you will be ambassadors back into the worlds and spheres of influence you have to talk about these things. Because as much as government has a huge role to play, and we are doing a great job, we can't do it by ourselves. It's only going to be in partnership with community, with clergy, with religious organizations, with nonprofits, if we're really going to make DC the kind of city it deserves to be and should be. As Sheldon said, I'm a third generation Washingtonian. I'm biased, so you'll take this with a grain of salt. There's no better city in the world to live in than Washington, D.C. And unless you think I'm just biased, let me tell you the evidence of why that's the case. We have more resources in this city, measured by any way you want to measure resources. We are the greenest city in North America. We have most rivers and green space and beautiful outdoor space in our city than anywhere. Most of the green space is in Ward 7. If you haven't used and enjoyed that part of our city and the great environment we have, encourage people to do it. Our office is 100% committed to how do we protect that great resource, that environmental resource that we have in our city. We have extraordinary historical and cultural resources in this city. Not just the federal city, not just the mall, but get out beyond that and you start seeing real cultural, whether it's music, arts, theater and history here in our city that is an aspiration that many communities would want to have. We've got great universities. Some seasons we have great sports teams. We have probably our most valuable resource is human talent. Whether you're multi-generational or you come here, we have really smart people and committed people who want to use their talents to making the world a better place. You want to make a lot of money, you go to Wall Street. You want to be an actor, maybe you go to Los Angeles. But if you want to use the law and policy and government to make the world a better place, you come to Washington. So we have all of those resources, and we have an extraordinary amount of money. Even as the economy is challenged, even as we're confronting challenge, we still are looking at a $20 billion budget as a city. And for all of us who lived through the control board and when we were broke, those dollars don't roll off your lips very easily to be able to say that we have that kind of resources. So we've got an extraordinary competitive advantage in DC. Our challenge as a city is that those resources aren't shared fairly and equitably across the city. And what that means is that not everybody gets a chance to enjoy the prosperity and the opportunity that our city has to offer. In the long run, that's our biggest challenge, I think, as a city and as a democracy. Is how do we make sure everybody gets a fair shot? And when I ran for Attorney General, that was the main reason that I wanted to run. I was seeing that challenge to my city and feeling like the law was the single best tool we had to address that type of inequity in our city. And I still am 100% committed to that. But the reality is that when public safety is on everybody's mind, when people are afraid to pump gas or go to the store or go out for dinner, get groceries, we don't get to those other questions of equity. And so we've got to address public safety. And we also have to recognize that public safety and inequity are inextricably linked. They're not separate, they're together. So our office has 4 primary mission pillars that are informed by what I heard from people while I was running, what I learned during my transition, and what we as a collective have decided my administration is going to be committed to. These 4 pillars are public safety and positive youth development, equity and access to justice, democratic values and statehood, and institutional excellence. I spend a lot of time when I speak to the public about uplifting young people in our city and recognizing that we have to think proactively about how we create healthy, hopeful, independent young people. And sometimes I catch a little flack for that. He's soft. He doesn't really want to hold kids accountable, and that misses the point. What I'm talking about in terms of lifting up, and we can go back to the prior slide. I don't know who's working the slides. Yeah, there we go. For now. Lifting up kids and creating hopeful kids is a public safety strategy. When children have hope, they are safer to themselves and to everybody around them. Everybody in this room knows that. And when kids are hopeless, they are dangerous to themselves and everybody around them. And that's before you get to the fact that young people from time immemorial have been going through a process of making mistakes, assessing risk, learning empathy, doing all the things that we all had to do to grow up and become kind, considerate adults. Some of us took longer than others to get there. Probably most of the men in the room know that you took longer than the women in the room to get there. But for many kids in our city, they don't have the privilege or the opportunity to make mistakes in safe places. They don't have people in their lives that are helping them to navigate that process or to see a bigger vision of what they're going to do with their lives. And so hopelessness is a real threat to public safety. So when we talk about how do we make sure we are investing in our young people, yes, it's part of the way we respond to public safety cases when they come in. It's part of the way we think about the abuse and neglect system and the way in which kids can get caught up in the foster care system. But it's also about how we think about child support, because that's another thing we do in our office. We are required to enforce child support obligations. And when mom and dad may not be living with one another or in love with one another anymore, but they're co-parenting, money is a friction in young people's lives. And the child support system can add more friction or less friction. So we think about how are we enforcing the law in a way that doesn't make that young person's life more unpleasant, more difficult than it already is. We think about it when we're talking about our affirmative litigation. What are we doing in terms of where we frame our lawsuits? We know that a lot of times young people do not have stable housing. When young people show up in the criminal justice system, my heart breaks when I hear a little bit about what's going on in a young person's life before they got arrested. They're hungry. They haven't slept in multiple days. They have no safe place to go home to. They've been out of school. Nobody's aware of where they are. Maybe they've been thrown out by their custodian or their parent for whatever reason. Our system has failed the young people a lot of times before they end up failing us by committing crimes. That's not to excuse it. It's just to have some context, because we can't arrest our way out of the criminal justice issues we've got in our city. We can't arrest and lock our way up out of the system. We have to arrest kids and we have to hold them accountable. And sometimes that means they have to get locked up. And unfortunately, that's happening more and more. The amount of serious crime that our office is prosecuting every day goes up. There was a time not that long ago where 1 or 2 homicide cases in a year would have been the average. Dozens of homicide cases, dozens of armed carjacking cases. And so the prosecutors in my office are having to prosecute very, very serious crimes. But we also have to recognize that if we don't do something proactive, we're just going to be on this treadmill of doing it. And we're going to look 4, 6, or 8 years down the road and we're going to be doing the same thing. So we try to use our affirmative litigation, our child support, our child and family services, and our public safety missions, all in furtherance of thinking about how do we get ahead of this. We are also, in addition to thinking about how we support young people, we're also supporting victims, because we know that there is a pattern that oftentimes said hurt people hurt people. And so we have to be mindful that there are real lives being disrupted by crime in our city, and we have to pay attention to that. And we have a lot of our resources and focus in the office on supporting victims and recognizing that there really aren't victimless crimes that are happening in our city. They impact quality of life. They impact the sense of safety that people have. And all of that contributes to quality of life in our city. When we talk about public safety in our city, what I think sometimes people ask me, like, what's the reason why we're experiencing so much crime? What's going on in Washington? And we have seen an uptick in certain kind of crime in our city. And we've also seen similar communities with a decrease. And so people wonder what's going on in Washington. And candidly, I think if you ask 10 criminologists that question, you get 10 different answers. I'll give you a little bit of my perspective on what I think is going on. First of all, we have way too many guns in Washington, D.C. Way too many illegal guns. It is way too easy to get a gun. It's way too easy to load your trunk up in Virginia and bring guns into the city. Our Supreme Court has made it exceedingly difficult to regulate guns. Our federal Congress has, in my humble opinion, abdicated its obligation to create reasonable gun control in our city and in our country. But one of the things we're trying to do in the office is everywhere we can address illegal guns, we're doing it. Part of it is suing gun manufacturers and online gun manufacturers for violating consumer protection laws. It's also defending in the courts our gun laws against Second Amendment attack. I mean, why do you need an extended magazine to go to church? Does the Second Amendment mean that you have to be able to carry a loaded gun on the metro or in a theater? But these attacks are coming in on our laws, and the Office of Attorney General is defending those laws. We work with our sister jurisdictions, particularly Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and the Arlington and Alexandria adjacent counties, because sometimes gun crimes cross jurisdictional boundaries. And as I said, we work very closely with the U.S. Attorney's Office. So we're doing everything we can to try to address guns. But the reality is, it's like water in the basement. You dry it up one place and it comes in another. And so we have to deal with guns from the demand perspective because the supply is overwhelming, at least in this legal environment that we're in right now. So we have too many guns. We also have lost the ability to engage with one another and resolve disagreements. Kids are having a hard time with that right now. Part of it, I want to say, is like, look at the adults in the room, Our country is having a hard time having conversation, resolving disagreements. We have an incredibly divisive body politic right now. But for young people, the opportunity to learn dispute resolution, the opportunity to figure out how do you resolve disagreements was totally disrupted by the pandemic. If you think about the age of kids, and where did you learn how to resolve disagreement? It's when you were in middle school. It was when you had to go to school and you had a coach or a counselor or a teacher that would help you sit down and resolve disagreement and start to use your words to resolve things. We all told our kids, you got to use your words. Well, a lot of kids for the time in the pandemic were totally removed from those types of protective factors right when they needed them the most. And we just went back to normal as if these kids didn't have any glitch in their lives. And we wonder, you couple that with the fact that now dissing one another, which has also been a time immemorial trait, particularly of young boys, now happens on the internet, happens on social media. When I was a kid, you went to the playground, somebody dissed you. It was only the 3 or 4 people around that saw it, and either you backed away from it or you got into a scrap. There were no guns, so the worst thing that happened that day was you went home with a bloody lip. Now the diss is on the internet. It's for everybody to see. It never goes away. And the resolution of that tiff is with a gun that's way too easy to find. You'd be surprised, shocked, heartbroken to know how many times there is a gun violence episode in our city that is because somebody has been disrespected about the girl he likes or the boy she likes or the girl she likes, whatever it might be, that's on Instagram. So social media has contributed to where we are in terms of this environment. And all of that swirls around in terms of trying to understand why we have an uptick in crime. So we try to do everything we can in terms of the law. Where we have a legal avenue to use, we use it. Where we can bring a lawsuit or investigation, we do it. We obviously have to prosecute cases when they come to us. But we also have another really important tool in our toolbox, which is, as the elected Attorney General, as the elected thought leader when it comes to law and justice, I have the standing to convene meetings to bring people together. And we've done that too, particularly around retail theft. A lot of the retail theft in our city, which is very disruptive and oftentimes threatening businesses that we need to stay engaged in our communities with the idea that they can't survive anymore. We sat around and said, what are we going to do about it? A lot of this crime, if it's organized crime, and people believe that the fencing of these stolen goods is being run by organized crime syndicates, I could say that's not my jurisdiction. I got kids, U.S. attorney, you got the adults. But I was hearing and seeing in my community the impact of it. And we said, we're going to do something about this. So we convened. We had a meeting with MPD, U.S. Attorney's Office, national retailers, local retailers. And we all came together and we talked about what people are saying. What can we do? Who do you call? What are some of the things we can do to try to address this issue? People came away from that meeting at least knowing what the different offices were doing, what good ideas people were using, who they call. And we've got some momentum in trying to coordinate around organized retail crime. It's a big issue, but it's a reminder for us in the office that even if we don't necessarily yet have a legal tool to use, we can use the office itself to convene people and ask people to come and work on issues together. So let me talk a little bit about one other thing that we try to do a lot of, and that's a real investment in community engagement. We wanted to make sure that the Office of Attorney General is known to people across the District of Columbia. When I was running for office and when I was getting into office, a lot of people knew we had an elected Attorney General. They had heard that had happened, but they didn't know what the Office of Attorney General did. And so we said we have to do a much better job of pushing information out, educating people across the district what our office does, how to reach us, what resources are available. We also have a public education mission, which is letting people know, warning people about threats, letting people know what the law is. It's much easier to allow somebody to protect themselves from being harmed than to have to sue for redress after somebody's been harmed. So, for example, relatively early in my administration, we were getting a lot of complaints about restaurants and restaurant fees and drip fees when people would go and eat. And then they'd see at the end of the meal that they had a service charge or something on the bill that they didn't know when they ordered. And all of a sudden, the meal that they thought was going to be $35 was $55. So we decided we had to do something about it. Now, some of the people on my team said, we got to sue these restaurants. You know, the restaurants are taking advantage. They're violating the Consumer Protection Act. They can't do that. And we talked about it as a team. We said, look, restaurants have struggled through the pandemic. They're critical to the ecosystem here in DC. Everybody, me in particular, loves to have a good meal or a good drink. How about if we roll out an alert and we tell the public and we tell restaurants what the law requires? So we did that. Now, you would have thought from some of the people in the restaurant industry that I was Attila the Hun for doing that. You know, like I caught so much flack about the fact that I put out an alert. And I said, guys, you know, I had no subpoenas, no litigation. All I did was put an alert out. We then had a follow-up process where we put more meat on the bones, a detailed Q&A about what you can do and what you can't do. And that time around, the restaurant owners were very appreciative of the process. And it's an example. Maybe I didn't do a great job the first time out. We should have had more collaboration. I thought we collaborated pretty well, but you can always collaborate more. And the second time, we got a little better in terms of rolling it out. So we can push information out. We recently pushed information out about our red flag laws. Not enough people know that we have very good red flag laws here in the District of Columbia that protects people who have lawfully possessed a gun, but maybe mentally ill, maybe going through something that puts them or people around them at risk. And our red flag laws are available to get those guns out of the hands of people who are lawfully owning the gun, but nonetheless are dangerous. We already have laws on the book that say if people are illegally possessing guns, they can be surrendered to the police, they can be brought forward. So we put out an alert to let people know how do the red flag laws work. So we're trying to use that public information aspect of our job to also advance public safety. We also know that as much as pushing information out in a community engagement effort is important, it's more important for us to be listening. For those of you who may remember from when I came and spoke to you before, I shared with you the advice my dad gave me about God giving us 2 ears and 1 mouth. You know, that is an ethos that we run through the office. We want to be listening twice as much as we're talking when we're in community. And when we listen and we show up and we're in the right places, we learn a lot about what people need and the way things are showing up on the ground, and we can address that. So I've invested very heavily in our community engagement team. We also are doing a lot in terms of our engagement with young people directly, because as adults, we oftentimes talk about kids. We don't talk with kids and we don't listen to kids. And when we do listen to young people, we actually find out a lot of really important information, particularly on things that like social media and the use of social media and music and trends. And young people, when you listen to them, have some really good ideas about how they're going to make themselves and their community safer. We are doing all of these things in terms of trying to change the narrative around kids. We have a Right Direction Awards annually. We recognize young people who have addressed and turned their lives around, faced adversity, maybe been involved in the system and found a way to get back on track. This year we had 30 awardees at our Right Direction Awards. We have a year-round program, a high school advisory council that we meet with young people once a week throughout the year. They're developing policy initiatives and recommendations. They come to me. We have an intensive 6-week program during the summer, part of the mayor's youth employment program, where the young people work on initiatives and recommend up to the AG in the front office, ideas that we can advance. We're working with the Mikvah Challenge organization on debate and civics and other things to get kids engaged, and telling kids, and I tell them all the time, you don't have to wait. Your time is right now. Use your voice, use your energy, use your powers that you have to change your community. You don't have to wait. And what we're finding is that when you let young people be empowered to do things, they do great things. They need adults around to guide them and to help them and encourage them. We do all of that. One of the other things that we are doing in the office, and maybe you've heard, is Cure the Streets. This is a violence interruption program. If we go a couple of slides down, you'll see where we are. We're in 10 different neighborhoods in the District of Columbia. This is a program that the Office of Attorney General is supporting, a little shy of a $9 million a year commitment. And what the effort of these Cure the Streets sites are is to interrupt cycles of violence in those neighborhoods in our city that have had the highest levels historically of gun violence. There's lots of reasons why gun violence occurs, but one common reason is it's a retaliatory cycle of gun violence and then people retaliating against the people who, and so what we're trying to do with Cure the Streets is disrupt that cycle. And violence interrupters in these locations go out, they try to make relationships, broker a peace, stop the retaliatory cycles, and then try to get people the services they need to try to get themselves back on track. We started with only a few sites. We've grown to 10 sites, and we're finding that these sites are making a difference both quantitatively and qualitatively as part of how we make our city safer. A hot issue in the city, at least in my world, is, why are you doing this in the Office of Attorney General? Shouldn't the mayor be doing this? And there's a history to why it started where it did and why we have different programs. I'm working with Mayor Bowser. Our teams are working to try to figure out how do we consolidate this type of critical work so that in the long run, what we're doing well is shared across the city. We avoid duplication, and we try to make sure what the best practices of this program get rolled out to as many people who can use it. But in addition to the grant making process around violence interruption work, which the Cure the Streets is we are about to roll out a grant prevention program. And we've been listening in the community. We've had community meetings. We have our last community meeting, I think, tomorrow. And then we will roll out an opportunity for people to apply for prevention grants. And unlike interruption, where you're really focusing on violence and cycles of violence that already exist, prevention is a much broader canvas to paint on. Some people say to me, Brian, you really should invest your money in helping mom before she comes home from the hospital with kiddo. That's the critical time where if we really focus on those first couple of years, we're going to turn the cycle. Other people say you ought to be focusing on returning citizens that are coming home from being locked up. That's how we're going to really turn. And the reality is everybody's right. And we don't have limitless money. And really the Attorney General's office under my leadership is not a grant making enterprise writ large. I see us as an innovator, as looking for pilot projects to see what we can test, see if we can replicate, and then hopefully turn it over to other agencies that are better at it. So grant making, investing, innovating is another aspect of what we're doing in the office around public safety. I think that, let me talk about one other thing we're doing, and then I'll stop and we can have some conversation. We are empowered to deal with truancy in the city. And for a lot of years, truancy was criminalized. We do not take a criminal approach to truancy in terms of locking up kids or locking up their parents when kids aren't getting to school. We're really trying to get to why are kids not showing up in school. We have a program that we call ATTEND that stands for Addressing Truancy Through Engagement and Negotiated Dialogue. Our ATTEND programs at 6 schools. It's a pilot project. 4 elementary schools and 2 middle schools, trying to address the root causes of why kids don't come to school. What does chronic absenteeism look like? I was shocked to learn this. Maybe you all know this already. To be defined as truant under our laws, it's 15 unexcused absences. And the unexcused absence is all day. By the time a young person has missed 15 days of school, they are so far beyond, so far behind, so far unfairly prejudiced in their ability to get an education. We have to try to get to it much quicker. But it's not through a criminal justice response. It's not by locking people up. It's figuring out why are kids not going to school. So this group gets out there working with attendance officers in the schools. When there's 3 or 4 absences, trying earlier to get in and figure out why kids aren't showing up. And you know, when you ask the question why, which is really the best question we can ever ask, except on cross-examination for the lawyers in the room, you never ask why, but when you really want to try to figure out what's going on, you ask, why aren't you in school? And you learn that for some kids, they don't have clean clothes and they smell. And when you're a teenager and you don't have clean clothes and your friends or your colleagues are going to make fun of you, you don't go to school. Some kids don't go to school because they're not safe getting from where they live to where they go to school. Some kids are being tasked with taking care of their little brothers and sisters or putting food in the refrigerator. So there are a lot of reasons why kids don't show up. And when you take the time to ask and get to the bottom of it, you can actually get them back on track. And that's what our Attend program is doing. We know if kids are chronically out of school, we know they fall behind on reading and things at an early age, they're much more likely to get involved in the criminal justice system. We can be proactive about these things. It's very frustrating to continue to face issues in the city where we know why they continue to happen and just be on the back end being told, be tougher. That's the political dialogue we're having right now. And so I'm going to end with this in terms of you all being thought leaders on this, and then happy to have a conversation with you. The conversation right now is driven by a media cycle that focuses on the negative and ignores the positive, highlights how terribly scary crime is and unacceptably high levels we have in our city right now, without any suggestion of solution, just a real focus on the problem, and says, we need to be tough. It's time to be tough. What do we mean by being tough? We need more police, and we need tougher sentences, and we need to lock people up quicker. And while they're pending trial, before we've even convicted them, we need to lock them up. And here's my take on it. I think that there can be a reasonable debate about those points. I'm going to say, for the sake of argument and the sake of harmony, yes, we need more police. And yes, we need to make sure that there's real accountability for crime. I know those are debatable points, and I'm going to just say, for the sake of argument, accept them as true right now. What's missing from the conversation is, how do we stop crime from happening in the first place? That's how we make ourselves safer as a city. When you ask your prosecutors and police to be more responsive, more penal, more draconian after crime has happened, you're already dealing with the crime having occurred. And you have to have faith that there's a deterrent impact. Assume that we don't have enough police in our city right now. Some people disagree with that. There's an ongoing audit to try to figure out what's the right number of police. We have more police officers in Washington, D.C. per capita than any police force in the country. We also ask the police in our city, we also ask the police in Washington, D.C. to do more than any police force in the city. So there can be an honest debate about whether we got the right number of police. We are not living in a pre-pandemic 1950s era where the allure of being a police officer and coming to work and working for 30 years to have a pension at age 55 is drawing people to sign up to be police officers. We don't want to rush to hire police officers who aren't trained, aren't the right kinds of folks to protect and serve. So we can't rush ahead and solve that issue by getting to whatever the magic number is with the snap of the fingers. It's going to take time. Similarly, we can't arrest and prosecute our way out of the problems right now, because guess what? We don't have the capacity. You're reading the newspaper. Our jails, DYRS, where we lock kids up at YSC and New Beginnings, we are constrained by resources and space. As business owners, as people engage, it's not like these things are costless. There's a cost associated with how we address these things. And of course, there's a cost of impact on young people and adults and emerging adults when we lock our way up and take a punitive approach to things, because the trauma associated with that, the impact it has on families, on communities, is also a cost. So I get frustrated when people want to talk about getting tougher on crime. And I say, what did we learn from the previous cycles of high violence we had in our city? What did we do right? And what didn't we do right? And are we smarter today than we were in the late 90s and early 2000s, where we took a very heavy incarceration approach to dealing with crime? So we got to do both. It's an and, it's a both and. It's not an either or. We got to hold kids accountable. We do. We got to send a message that it's not acceptable to break the law. We have to make people know that lives are impacted by crime. And we have to think about, how do we stop crime from happening in the first place? And I just want that third leg of the stool: policing, prosecuting, and proactive investment to all be part of the conversation. I know that Fox News doesn't have time often for the third prong, but you all do. You all do when you go out and talk to people in your spheres of influence. So thank you for listening to me on my soapbox. I'd love to hear some reaction or questions or thoughts about what the office is doing.
Thank you so much for speaking. Stand up here for a second. As you know, we have a tradition, because you already have one, for presenting each of our speakers with their very own tree. So we will plant another tree for you. You have two now. And this particular one, you can find the coordinates. This will show you where your tree actually is. I think that's on there. And now you have some jewelry, a pin to go along with it. So
Thank you so much.
thank you, and thank you once again for always being who you are. Since I've met you, you've stood your ground, and I appreciate it. And so, yes, yeah.
Thank you.